April 11th, 1951, just after midnight. The White House was almost completely dark. No visitors, no photographers, no applause. On the second floor, in a small pool of yellow lamplight, Harry S. Truman stood alone at his desk, looking down at a piece of paper that could blow a hole in his presidency. It was not a speech, not a treaty. It was a dismissal order. Relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. Truman had read those words so many times they were burned into his eyes. He didn't need the paper anymore, but he kept it in front of him, as if the ink itself were daring him to sign. From another room, the radio he'd forgotten to turn off was drifting through the quiet. Call-in show. Korea. A man's voice, angry and certain. If Washington would just get out of the way and let MacArthur win this thing. He promised the boys would be home by Christmas. I believe him, not those politicians. The host laughed. You trust the general more than the president? Damn right I do, the caller snapped. MacArthur's a winner. Truman just sits in a chair. Truman closed his eyes for a moment. That last line hit where it always hit. Just sits in a chair. He was commander-in-chief of the most powerful military on earth. He had signed off on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He had stared down Stalin over Berlin. He had helped build NATO, the alliance that stood between Europe and Soviet tanks. And in his own country, millions of people thought the man in Tokyo, with his sunglasses and his battered cap, cared more about victory than the man in the Oval Office. Tonight, if Truman signed this order, he would find out whether he still ran the American military or whether he was just borrowing the furniture. To understand how he reached this moment, you have to understand the man whose name sat on that page and the way that man had just humiliated his president in front of the entire world. Douglas MacArthur did not think of himself as anyone's subordinate. He was 70 years old and had lived more years in uniform than Truman had spent in politics. He had been wounded in World War I. In the 1930s, he had run the entire U.S. Army. In World War II, he had become the face of the Pacific, the man who had been driven out of the Philippines, promising, "I shall return," and then had actually returned at the head of an armada. He had stood on the deck of the battleship Missouri and accepted Japan's surrender. After that, he ruled occupied Japan like a king without a crown. He rewrote the Constitution. He reshaped the schools. He told the Japanese emperor when to speak and when to be silent. He didn't just command an army. He presided over a world. He lived in the top floor of the Daiichi building in Tokyo, riding an elevator that opened directly into his office. His staff moved around him like priests in a temple. He walked out onto balconies to let crowds chant his name. He gave speeches that sounded like Holy Scripture. He dressed like no one else. Open shirt, pipe, cap. Because he knew he didn't have to look like a general to be treated like one. He believed that history watched him personally. Harry Truman could not have been more different. 5'8", glasses thick enough that, without them, the world was a blur. He'd never gone to West Point. His big failure in life was a men's clothing store in Kansas City that went bankrupt. He was a county politician, a senator, the kind of man who remembered people's birthdays and listened more than he spoke. When Franklin Roosevelt picked him as vice president, it was because he was loyal and safe, not because anyone saw him as a future commander of the free world. Then Roosevelt died. Suddenly, the safe, forgettable man in the background was sitting at the resolute desk with a world war still raging. From the day he took office, Truman knew exactly how people saw him. the little man from Missouri, in a chair built for a giant. And MacArthur knew that too. On paper, MacArthur reported to Truman. In his own mind, he reported to victory and to history, two bosses far more important than any politician in Washington. For a few years, that quiet contempt stayed under control. Truman let MacArthur rebuild Japan with minimal interference. MacArthur sent back reports and recommendations, written in the lofty language of a man whose voice had never really learned the word no. They barely saw each other. They barely spoke. Their relationship was paperwork. Then Korea exploded, June 25th, 1950. Before dawn, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel. Tanks, artillery, infantry, South Korean units broke. American advisors sent panicked reports. This is a full invasion. Most Americans couldn't find Korea on a map. Truman understood exactly where it was and what it meant. 5 years earlier, the democracies had watched Hitler take bite after bite out of Europe while they hesitated. Conference after conference, excuse after excuse. Then the bill for that hesitation had arrived in blood. Now Stalin's side was testing the free world again, this time through a small, battered peninsula in Asia. If the United States let South Korea fall, Truman believed, every ally would hear the same message. American promises are optional. He made the decision in hours. Under the flag of the United Nations, American forces would fight in Korea. The war would not be a police action in any real sense. It would be a real war, with real casualties. But he hoped it would stay limited, contained. There was only one man he could realistically put in charge: Douglas MacArthur. From Tokyo, MacArthur commanded U.S. occupation forces in Japan. He had the bases, the staff, the experience, and the ego for another major war. Truman handed him the job. The first reports back were grim. By late summer, American and South Korean forces had been pushed back into a shrinking corner of the peninsula around a port called Pusan. Soldiers fresh from peacetime duty found themselves in a landscape of mud, monsoon rains, and relentless enemy pressure. Units fell back in panic. Trucks clogged roads. Equipment was abandoned in ditches. Newspapers printed maps where the North Korean advance looked like a dark tide swallowing the South. "Are we losing in Korea?" one headline asked. Truman watched his approval ratings slide. Families stared at photographs of their sons in uniform and wondered why they were dying in a place they'd never heard of. Congress muttered. Pundits demanded answers. In Tokyo, MacArthur studied a different map. He hated the idea of clinging to a defensive pocket. He was not a hold-the-line man. He believed in drama. He pointed to a tiny port near Seoul, Inchon. Tides so extreme they could strand ships on bare mud. A narrow channel guarded by islands. Seawalls too high for landing craft. Every Navy officer who studied it said the same thing. This is a terrible idea. MacArthur loved it. The very things that terrified cautious minds made his eyes light up. Precisely because Inchon looked insane, he believed it would be undefended. The enemy would never expect a landing there. He stood before the Joint Chiefs and demolished their objections with sheer confidence. Yes, the tides were a nightmare. Yes, the seawalls were high. Yes, the channel was narrow. All true, he said, and that was why it would work. Truman wasn't in that room. He got the written version. The choice was brutal. Accept a wild gamble from a general who believed he was touched by destiny, or watch the slow, grinding destruction of the Pusan Perimeter. He approved Inchon, September 15th, 1950. Marines and soldiers stormed ashore at Inchon. The tides cooperated. The defenders were stunned. Within days, Seoul was retaken. At the same time, UN forces hammered their way out of the Pusan Perimeter and drove north. The North Korean army collapsed into a disorganized retreat. The dark tide on the maps reversed. MacArthur's masterpiece screamed the headlines. From disaster to victory. Photographs of MacArthur striding ashore, corncob pipe jutting from his mouth, filled the front pages. Time and Life put his face on their covers. Commentators called him a military genius. Churches prayed for him by name. Truman's numbers in the polls went up, but not for him. Not really. In living rooms across America, people didn't say, Truman saved Korea. They said, MacArthur did it. If you had asked an ordinary American that autumn who they trusted more with their sons' lives, Harry Truman or Douglas MacArthur, the answer would have stung. That new, unspoken hierarchy mattered because now the question changed. Not, can we save South Korea? But how far are we going to go? The original UN mandate was simple. Push the invaders back across the 38th parallel. A lot of people in Washington wanted to stop there. Korea would be free. The invasion repelled, the line restored. It would be bloody and ugly, but limited. MacArthur saw limited as another word for weak. He wanted to keep going. Cross the 38th parallel, smash the North Korean state, unify the peninsula under a pro-Western government. End the threat once and for all. There was a problem. Two vast, suspicious powers sat just above Korea, the Soviet Union and the newborn People's Republic of China. Both warned that if UN forces reached the Yalu River, China's border, they might intervene. Truman saw a nightmare. American troops fighting Chinese troops, maybe Soviet volunteers, maybe Soviet pilots. Nuclear weapons on the table now, not as theory, but as real tools. Korea turning from a limited war into the trigger for World War III. 3. So he tried to do something incredibly delicate. He allowed the advance north, but he wrote limits into MacArthur's orders in cold, precise language. No bombing across the Yalu into Chinese territory. No attacks on Manchuria. No actions that might widen the conflict without direct authorization from Washington. MacArthur read those limits, and then he acted as if history outranked them. From Tokyo, he dismissed the warnings about China. His reports downplayed the danger. When officers in the field sent up nervous messages about Chinese volunteers, he treated them as exaggerations. He promised victory by Christmas. He didn't see himself as managing a limited war for a cautious president. He saw himself as opening the main front in a global struggle, with or without the approval of the man in the Oval Office. In October 1950, Truman tried to look his general in the eye and get the truth. They met on Wake Island, a lonely Pacific dot turned into an airstrip. The summit was staged for the cameras, president and general, shaking hands, smiling under the hard tropical sun. The choreography looked friendly. The details told a different story. MacArthur arrived late. Truman, who valued punctuality almost as much as honesty, noticed. When they met, MacArthur did not salute. He shook the president's hand as if they were two heads of state, equals, not commander and subordinate. Truman asked about the Chinese. MacArthur brushed it off. He described the chances of major Chinese intervention as slight. If they came in large numbers, he said, he would make a slaughter out of it. The boys would be home by Christmas. No doubt. No hesitation. Truman flew back to Washington with those words in his ears. He had to trust somebody. The newspapers trusted MacArthur. Congress trusted MacArthur. Millions of families trusted MacArthur. So Again, the little man from Missouri trusted the big general in Tokyo. He would not forget that decision, because almost everything MacArthur told him on Wake Island turned out to be wrong. As UN forces pushed north, evidence poured in that Chinese forces were crossing the Yalu. Prisoners talked about new units. Soldiers reported hearing bugles at night, seeing unfamiliar uniforms, finding frozen corpses with Chinese characters on their papers. On the other side of the river, Mao Zedong watched the maps and made his own decision. He would not stand by while American-led troops parked on China's border. He sent hundreds of thousands of volunteers across the river at night. They marched without lights, hid in the mountains by day, and waited. At MacArthur's headquarters, reports of this buildup were filtered into the same comfortable picture. Limited involvement, nothing an American-led army couldn't handle. Then winter came. In late November 1950, UN forces stretched deep into North Korea along icy, narrow roads. Units were separated by mountains, by miles, by faulty intelligence. The Chinese came out of the dark. They hit at the Chongchon River in the west, at the Chosin Reservoir in the east. They blew bugles and attacked at night from ridgelines the Americans thought were empty. Entire regiments found themselves surrounded in temperatures so cold that rifle bolts froze to bare fingers. Men who had written home about mopping up suddenly found they were fighting to avoid annihilation. In the Oval Office, Truman received the first panicked cables. Heavy enemy contact. Withdrawing under pressure. Heavy casualties. The arrow he had watched push north on the maps now snapped backwards. This was not home by Christmas. This was chaos. At the Chosin Reservoir, Marines and soldiers fought their way out through snow and ice, dragging their wounded on improvised sleds, leaving behind frozen bodies they could not carry. In the west, units fell back in disorder, abandoning equipment to keep from being cut off. The American public, who had just been told the war was all but won, woke up to headlines about retreat, reversal, disaster. Truman looked at those headlines and thought of Wake Island. He thought of MacArthur's easy confidence, his promise of slaughter, on the wrong side. Thousands of American boys were paying for that arrogance with missing limbs, frozen lungs, and shallow graves under Korean snow. And even then, Truman held to a line. He did not want to turn Korea into the spark of a global war. He still believed the conflict had to stay limited, contained to the peninsula. No bombing of Chinese territory. No nuclear strikes. No Second World War replay. Just hotter. MacArthur looked at the same catastrophe and saw something else. To him, the entrance of Chinese forces was not a warning. It was an excuse to finally do what he wanted all along, take the war to China. He asked to bomb Chinese bases and bridges across the Yalu. He talked about unleashing nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. In private conversations, he floated ideas that made some officers' blood run cold. Using atomic bombs to create belts of radioactive glass, cutting Chinese supply lines permanently. This was not just a disagreement over tactics. It was a clash over the very definition of victory, of morality, of survival. And then MacArthur crossed a line no American general had ever crossed. He went over his president's head. In March 1951, while Truman's team quietly explored ceasefire possibilities, MacArthur wrote a letter to Republican House Leader Joseph Martin. In it, he attacked the administration's policy of limited war. He said there was no substitute for victory. He accused unnamed leaders, everyone knew who he meant, of sacrificing soldiers' lives for political caution. Martin had the letter read aloud on the floor of Congress. Every word was now public. Think about what that looked like to the average American. On one side, a general with a chest full of medals, promising total victory if only the politicians would get out of his way. On the other, a president with slipping poll numbers, asking for patience, compromise, and limits. Who do angry, frightened people trust more in that moment, the warrior or the worrier? In the West Wing, an aide brought Truman the text of the Martin letter. He read it once, then again. He saw his own war, his own office, described as if he were the obstacle to victory. He saw a man he had empowered, supported, backed in front of Congress and the press, now presenting himself as the true voice of the nation, and the president as a coward who didn't want to win. This was not a private argument anymore. This was a general waging politics in the middle of a war. Truman did not throw the paper. He did not scream. But something hardened. He had spent his life believing that the American system only works if the military is firmly, unquestionably under civilian control. Voters choose leaders. Leaders set policy. Generals execute it, or resign. If Douglas MacArthur could openly attack the president's strategy in a letter designed to rally opposition in Congress and still keep his command, then that chain would snap. The next president, and the one after that, would rule at the mercy of whichever general had the loudest cheering section. This was not an argument over maps anymore. It was an argument over whether the United States would be ruled through ballots or through medals. That is what brought Truman to that desk on April 11th, with the radio buzzing in the background and the dismissal order on the blotter. He thought of the angry caller who trusted MacArthur more than the politicians. He thought of mothers writing letters to Tokyo instead of to Washington. He thought of his own mother, back in Missouri, who loved MacArthur and had never quite forgiven her son for being a Democrat. He knew what would happen if he signed. Newspapers would call him petty, jealous, small. They would say he couldn't stand that another man was more admired. Politicians would smell blood. There would be hearings, insults, threats of impeachment. He also knew what would happen if he didn't sign. He would stay in the White House. The Marine Band would still play "Hail to the Chief" when he walked into a room. But everyone in that room would know the truth. The real power, the man who could defy the president and live to brag about it, would be sitting in Tokyo. Harry Truman picked up his pen. Somewhere across the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur slept, certain that no one in Washington had the courage to touch him. In the quiet of the White House, the little man from Missouri proved him wrong. He signed the order dismissing the most popular general in America in the middle of a war. In a few hours, the country would wake up to a political earthquake. Some would call Truman a traitor to victory. Others would call him the last line of defense between the Constitution and a uniform. But one thing would be clear. The battle between ballots and medals had just gone from cold to white hot. And the real war for America's soul was only beginning. On the morning of April 11th, 1951, Washington woke up to an earthquake that hadn't registered on any seismograph. The first people to feel it were not generals or senators. They were the overnight workers in the newsrooms. Teletype machines rattled out a bulletin from the White House. Editors leaned over the paper as the words came in. President Truman has relieved General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of his command. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room exploded. Get this on the front page. Banner. Phone Tokyo. What's the reaction from Congress? Someone turned up the volume on the radio. Within minutes, the bulletin hit the airwaves. A calm announcer's voice tried to make the words sound routine. President Harry S. Truman has removed General Douglas MacArthur from his command in the Far East, naming General Matthew Ridgway as his replacement. In living rooms across America, people stopped buttering their toast. What do you mean, removed? In a Missouri kitchen, Truman's mother heard the bulletin. She adored MacArthur. She did not adore Harry's political friends. Over the years, she had made that very clear. When she heard that her son had fired her favorite general, she turned to a neighbor and said the line that later haunted Truman. I always knew Harry would do something like this to General MacArthur. The little man from Missouri had finally dared to touch the marble statue standing in the National Living Room. Now, he would find out how many people cared more about the statue than about the man who had sworn to uphold the Constitution. In Tokyo, Douglas MacArthur woke up as if it were any other morning. At 8 o'clock, his aide, Major General Courtney Whitney, arrived at the Daiichi building. The stars and stripes still flew. Japanese and American staff were already at their desks. The world had not yet shifted in MacArthur's mind. Then the phone rang. MacArthur picked it up, expecting another update, another cable, another day in which he, as he liked to say, stood on the ramparts of freedom. Instead, he heard the news. The president had relieved him of his command. According to one version, MacArthur's first response was cool and almost bored. I have just been fired, he said, as if talking about the weather. According to another, he clenched his jaw and said nothing at all. Whatever the exact words, the meaning was the same. The man he had always treated as a small, temporary figure in Washington had just proved that his signature, not MacArthur's legend, still controlled the United States Army. Outside, crowds were already gathering. When MacArthur and his wife left Tokyo days later, the streets were lined with thousands of Japanese citizens. Some bowed. Some waved flags. Many simply stared at the man who had ruled their country for years and was now being sent away by his own. He boarded the plane not as a defeated general, in his mind, but as a martyr. Across the Pacific, in the United States, that's exactly how millions of people chose to see him. Newspapers rolled off the presses with headlines that might as well have been accusations. Truman axes MacArthur. War hero fired. General who promised victory removed by politicians. In barbershops and diners, in factory break rooms, and church parking lots, the same conversation broke out. Can you believe this? In the middle of a war? He's the only one who knew how to win. Some spoke of impeachment, not of MacArthur, of Truman. On Capitol Hill, telephones rang so constantly that some offices stopped answering. Senators and congressmen received sacks of mail, almost all saying the same thing. MacArthur is right. Truman is wrong. Do something. The man Truman had fired was still collecting loyalty like a magnet. The man who had fired him was collecting enemies. The White House released a carefully worded statement. Truman said he had fired MacArthur with the deepest personal regret, but insisted that he had no choice. No general, however famous, could be allowed to defy the policies set by the elected government. It was the language of law and responsibility. Most people didn't hear that. They heard something simpler. The politician had silenced the warrior. MacArthur, meanwhile, was preparing for his next stage. He wasn't going to disappear quietly into retirement. The man who had just been fired for going public with his disagreements was now about to go as public as any general had ever gone. He landed in San Francisco to a reception that looked less like the return of a dismissed officer and more like the arrival of a conquering king. Sirens, bands, banners, hundreds of thousands of people lined his route, crowding onto sidewalks, hanging out of windows, climbing on lampposts just to glimpse the famous cap and pipe. Some waved American flags, others waved signs that said, "We love Mac and let him win." He rode in an open car, standing, his hand lifted in a half salute, half blessing. Confetti fell like snow. He looked left and right, expression grave, as if he accepted not their sympathy, but their confirmation that he had been wronged. For the watching world, the message was brutal. In Tokyo, a president's order had ended a command. In San Francisco, the people were voting with their throats. If you were Harry Truman, sitting in the White House watching that reception on newsreels, you had to wonder, who does the country think is really in charge? That question got louder when MacArthur went to Washington. Congress summoned him to testify. Officially, the hearings were about the conduct of the war in Korea and the circumstances of General MacArthur's relief. Unofficially, everyone knew what they really were. A public trial of two men's visions, the general's demand for total victory and the president's insistence on limited war. MacArthur arrived in the capital like a head of state. He stayed at the Statler Hotel. Crowds gathered outside, chanting his name. When he walked into the hearing room in his open shirt and khaki trousers, the same almost rumpled style he had worn in the Pacific, the place erupted. Applause, whistles, shouts of, "MacArthur! MacArthur!" Senators who opposed Truman shook his hand as if they were greeting a visiting emperor. He sat down, adjusted his papers, and looked at the packed room. Senators, representatives, journalists, spectators wedged into the gallery. He knew exactly what he was about to do. He had been fired for speaking out. Now he would speak out with the microphone of the United States Congress in front of him and the American public listening on radio and watching in newsreels. He began with a line that went straight for the nation's heart. "Mr. Chairman, I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams." He painted himself as a man who had given his entire life to the country, a man whose one thought, one mission, had been victory. He spoke of battlefields and sacrifices, of soldiers who had followed him through jungles and across oceans. He did not rant. He did not shout. He did something more dangerous. He sounded reasonable. He argued that there was no point in sending American boys to fight a war if their leaders had no intention of winning it. He said that a limited war in Korea, under restrictions designed to avoid provoking China and the Soviet Union, was condemning American troops to die for lines on a map that would keep shifting. He made it sound as if Truman wanted to lose slowly, while he, MacArthur, simply wanted to end the suffering with one decisive blow. "This is an entirely new war," he said, "unprecedented in the history of war itself, a war limited in its aim, in its scope, in its weapons. That is why our soldiers bleed and die on frozen hills without the chance to finish the job." Every senator who already disliked Truman heard the music under the words. They weren't just listening to a retired officer. They were listening to a potential candidate. Then came the line that would echo far beyond the hearing room. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. He borrowed it from an old barracks song, but when he spoke it, his voice caught just enough to sound genuinely wounded. He did not fade away that day. He exploded. People cried in the gallery. Congressmen dabbed at their eyes. Some stood and applauded, breaking the usual rules. For many Americans, hearing those words on the radio, it sounded like a farewell from a man who had been punished not for failure, but for being the only one brave enough to demand victory. Every tear that fell for MacArthur that day was, in a sense, an accusation against the man who had fired him. Back in the White House, Truman listened. He heard the applause through the radio. He saw the headlines. He knew that somewhere, in living rooms across the country, people were nodding along with MacArthur's every word, thinking, "He's right. Why fight if you won't win?" But Truman also knew something those applause lines carefully stepped around. MacArthur's version of victory was not just about Korean hills. It was about bombing Chinese cities. It was about risking a massive land war in Asia with hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, of American troops. It was about playing nuclear roulette with the Soviet Union watching from the wings. MacArthur never had to sit in the Oval Office and imagine a telegram that began with the words, "Soviet forces have crossed the border." Truman did. He read the transcript of the hearings line by line. He saw how MacArthur wrapped his own ambitions and his own miscalculations in the language of honor and sacrifice. He also saw the key omission. MacArthur spoke as if the only choices were cowardly stagnation or total victory. He did not talk about the third option, the one Truman had been trying to hold on to since the first day of the war. A bloody, imperfect, limited conflict that did not tip over into global annihilation. MacArthur's world was black and white. Truman was living in the gray, and nobody writes songs about gray. Politically, the price of that gray was brutal. Truman's approval ratings sank into the 20s. Polls showed that a majority of Americans sided with MacArthur. Letters poured into the White House calling the president soft, weak, even traitorous. "Let the general win," they said. "Stop tying his hands. Why are you afraid of victory?" It is hard to explain mutual assured destruction to a mother staring at a photograph of her son in a frozen Korean valley. It is even harder when another man is promising that if he had his way, her son would have been home already. Some Democrats quietly distanced themselves from Truman. Republicans talked openly about impeachment or censure. It looked for a moment as if the gamble Truman had made, defending the principle of civilian control over the most popular general in the country, might finish him. On a personal level, the attacks cut deeper than he admitted. He heard people say that he had fired MacArthur out of jealousy, that he had never forgiven the general for his fame, that a man who had once failed at running a clothing store could not tolerate standing in the shadow of a living legend. He shrugged in public. In private, he kept a simple, stubborn line. "I didn't fire him because he was a great man," he said later. "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the office of the president." The office, not Harry Truman, not the little man from Missouri. The office. He knew he would not be there forever. MacArthur would not be there forever. The war would end one day, somehow. But if the unwritten rule that generals answer to civilians cracked, that crack would run through American history long after both of them were gone. While the hearings went on, the war in Korea continued. Men still bled on hills with names most Americans could not pronounce. Negotiations for an armistice crept forward, then stalled, then crept again. The front hardened roughly around the 38th parallel, the same line where it had all begun. MacArthur's promised victory, unified Korea, destroyed Chinese capability, communism rolled back by force, never came. Not under him, not under anyone. Korea ended not with a parade, but with a signature on an armistice in 1953. The country remained divided. The war was neither a clear win nor a clear loss. It was exactly what Truman had feared and tried to manage. A limited, muddy, morally unsatisfying conflict that did not explode into something far worse. Truman left office with his reputation shredded. He had chosen not to run again in 1952. His party was exhausted. The country wanted a new face. The man they chose was another general, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a war hero who had never publicly defied the president, who believed deeply in civilian control, but who still allowed Truman's name to be dragged in the dust during the campaign. Truman boarded a train back to Missouri as a deeply unpopular man. People muttered that he had lost China, lost Korea, lost everything except his own stubborn pride. MacArthur, meanwhile, gave speeches, flirted with the idea of running for president, and watched his own star slowly drift. That's the part of the story that most people living through it couldn't see. They could feel the heat. They couldn't see the horizon. History, unlike talk radio, moves on a longer clock. Years later, when the horrors of nuclear weapons were better understood, when the Soviet Union's own arsenal grew, when the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the edge of annihilation, people started to ask a different question about Korea. Not, why didn't we win bigger? But how close did we come to ending everything? Documents emerged. Plans came to light. People began to see how seriously some of MacArthur's proposals had been considered. Bombing Manchurian cities, using dozens of atomic weapons, opening a wider war in Asia. They imagined what that would have meant in a world where Stalin might have answered in Europe, where mushroom clouds could have bloomed not just over Asian rivers, but over German cities. In that light, Truman's weakness started to look less like cowardice and more like a kind of hard, unglamorous courage. The courage to be hated now in order to avoid something much worse later. Historians, not talk show callers, began to write the scorecard. Many of them came to the same verdict. Truman had been right to fire MacArthur. Not because MacArthur was incompetent, he wasn't, but because he had crossed a line that no democracy can afford to blur. MacArthur had walked into politics wearing a uniform and dared the president to stop him. Truman had. The old general's line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," took on a different flavor with time. It sounded less like tragic poetry and more like the right thing. In a healthy republic, generals do fade away. Presidents leave. New ones arrive. Elections replace one civilian with another. The machine keeps working, not perfectly, not cleanly, but under the control of people who can be voted out. That is what Truman had been defending in that small lamplit room on April 11th when he picked up his pen. He did not look like a hero. He did not sound like a hero. He did something most heroes in the public imagination never have to do. He chose the boring, lonely, thankless path. He said no to the man wearing the medals, knowing that for years, almost everyone would say he was wrong. For a long time, the country saw the story as simple. the great general punished by the small president. Only slowly, as archives opened and new wars taught new bitter lessons, did the deeper version emerge. The moment when a tired, unpopular president reminded a dazzled nation that, in America, even the greatest general in the world is still an employee. Ballots, not medals, decide who gives the orders. That is the real battle that was fought when Harry Truman signed Douglas MacArthur's dismissal. It did not happen on a hill in Korea. It happened in a quiet room in the White House. And its shock waves still shape every time a soldier salutes a civilian and says the words that MacArthur, in his heart, could never quite accept. Yes, Mr. President,